Hello, my name is Sally Bambakidis, and I'm the archivist for the Dayton and Montgomery County Public Library. A few years ago, the Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church had a big exhibit with 500 photographs, and I approached the community to donate 100 photographs to the Dayton and Montgomery County Public Library. From these 100 photographs that they are in permanent position in special collections in the local history room, we selected 50 photographs, and we started this big exhibit in the auditorium, which began September 14th, and it will go on until end of October, year 2001. With this exhibit, we also had a very nice program with a keynote speaker from Ohio State University, Dr. George Anagnostou, and also we had 5 panelists from our community that were describing the history of our community. I hope this collection will stay permanently in our library, which will tell the story of our fathers to our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-great-grandchildren. Thank you.
My name is Tim Cambich. I'm the director of the Dayton Montgomery County Public Library, and I'm just so pleased about this program today. It's a lot of excitement to it, a lot of excitement I hear from the voices in the crowd. And before we get to our speakers, I'd just like to throw out a couple thanks for a number of people that helped put this together. Probably one of the most recognizable aspects of it is the exhibit that you see here under the name A New Home, From Greece to a Gem City. This exhibit is a series of photographs that were donated through the HEPA organization, and is only a part of the collection of photographs which have been expertly preserved and mounted for this particular exhibit. One of the people I'd like to recognize is Lindy McDonough, who is the staff artist for the library, who does a lot of exhibit mountings and things like that for the library, and I think she's just done a wonderful job at presenting these. But certainly the person that's done the most to help make this program a reality has been Ellie Bambakidis. And where is Ellie at? Because it was really through her efforts and her relationships with the people in the Greek community that helped really pull this all together. The Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church is had celebrated its 75th anniversary, and that's where I think this exhibit really got started, was to help take some of the photographs that were part of that display, part of that celebration, and preserve them. And that's something that the library has done with a number of their collections. This particular collection probably would not have had the impetus to be preserved if it hadn't been for the Annunciation Investment Fund. And I know Chris Poulos is here. He had helped make sure that we had some of the funding to make this happen, so I very much appreciate that. I'm going to be turning the podium over here shortly to Pat Sourtopoulos, and she's going to introduce our speakers and the panel discussion. But I do want to make sure that the Daughters of Penelope get some kudos for the refreshments that we're going to have in the meeting room next to us after the presentation. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Patricia, and get the program started. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Gosh, lots of you, and it's wonderful. It is really wonderful for our community. On behalf of the Greek community, I would like to welcome you to this wonderful exhibit, A Century of the Dayton Greek American Experience. Hopefully, by the end of the afternoon, you will have learned more about how the Greeks came and succeeded in the Dayton area. I would like to thank Tim, the director of the Dayton Montgomery County Library, for all his direction in making this possible. Ellie Bambakidis, the archivist chair and a member of our community, along with her committee members, for their coordination of this event. Father Stratton Dorozinski and Father Dean Nastos for their full support of this program. Our thanks also go out to the library, HEPA and the Annunciation Foundation for funding this program, and also the Daughters of Penelope, who is hosting the reception later this afternoon. Last but not least, we want to thank Carrie Boris, moderator, and the panel who will be presenting the Dayton Greek American experience for Daytonians, and afterwards they'll be answering any questions that you may have. Without further ado, I'd like to at this time introduce Dr. Georgios Nostou, our keynote speaker. He was born in Greece and graduated with a degree in civil engineering from the Polytech University in Thessaloniki. He came to the United States in 1985 and received a master's degree in anthropology from Louisiana State University in 1992 and a PhD from Ohio State University in 1999 in modern Greek studies. He is now on the faculty of the Department of Greek and Latin at the Ohio State, specializing in modern Greek studies. He will speak to us today on the Greek immigrants in America. Dr. Nostou.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Καλησπέρα σας. Well, I am honored and delighted to be here. I would like the organizing committee for their invitation. Perhaps could I
Oh,
hold
yes,
this?
you could
Okay,
do that.
great. Thank you. Βρήκατε το τραπέζι στρωμένο. You found the table set. These were the words of Tom, an 82-year-old Greek immigrant who conveyed this statement to me when I was very new in the United States in 1985. And when I asked Tom to elaborate, what did he mean that the new immigrants, the post-1980s immigrants, found the table set, in perhaps a typical Greek fashion, did not give me a straightforward answer. He gave me a Delphic answer. You have to find for yourself. For the last 10, 12 years, through my studies, I have been trying to understand what kind of investment Greek immigrants for 100 years have put their energies, their commitments in order to create a new life in the United States. In retrospect, 15 years after Tom's statement, I think his expression, his encouragement to find for myself the meaning of the Greek immigrant experience, in many ways, I think exemplifies the Greek immigrant spirit. And perhaps I should say that this spirit is building bridges between cultures, between American and Greek culture, building bridges between generations, building bridges between Greek immigrants and American-born Greek Americans or American Hellenes or American Greeks. There are different labels which describe the different identities Greek Americans assume. And in many ways describes the ultimate challenge for Greek immigrants, I felt, which was to create a home here in the United States for themselves. And I think I saw the title of the exhibit, From Creating a Home from Greece to the Gem City. This is the ultimate bridge to build, to create a new home in a new land. And for immigrant, that was a challenge, and that was a difficult challenge. In my presentation, I would like to give you a short overview of the 100 years of Greek immigrant experience. Of course, it is a daunting task. It is a difficult task to be able to convey in half an hour what happened in Greek America for a century. And I think that the difficulty for conveying this experience is not only that we are dealing with a long time span, but it is because I believe there is no such a thing as one Greek American experience. There is not one experience that everybody shares. There are different immigrant experiences depending on one's gender, on one's time of arrival in the United States, of one's even perhaps class status. It made a difference in the early 1900s if you were working in the railroad construction in Nevada, in labor camps, and you were isolated, versus if you were, let's say, in multi-ethnic Chicago and you were operating a candy store. It made a difference if you were an immigrant who was alone without the support of the kinship network. It made a difference if you were a man in the West versus a woman, a Greek immigrant man versus an immigrant woman. It made a difference if, as a son or daughter of immigrants, you had to work since early childhood, as opposed to if you were the son or a daughter of a middle class who somehow did not have to work and the focus was education. So there are different experiences associated with different individuals, and I don't think that I can do justice to this heterogeneity, to this variety of experiences. But what I would like to do, and I would like to organize my talk about this building bridges, and I would like just to comment on some investments of Greek America to build the bridge between the Greek culture and the American culture. And also I have decided to convey this story to you through photographs. Photographs are wonderful mediums to tell stories. Photographs generate memories of the past. And photographs situate individual stories into wider experiences of the community and even the history of the nation. So it will be very interesting, I think, to see after my story how your stories, your individual stories, as well the collective story of the Dayton experience overlap or diverge as the case might be. I would like to start at the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, when we have an astonishing wave of immigrants arriving in the United States, 20 million people. 20 million people from southeastern Europe arrived between 1890 and 1920 in the US. And the reason that the American economy was able to accommodate this astonishing number of immigrants was because America at the time was experiencing its industrial revolution. There was a boom of industrial construction, and there was a great need for labor, cheap labor, so that will participate in this industrial machine that would eventually be the starting step for the ascendancy of the United States as a global power. So perhaps I should then start with some of the images that the first immigrants were exposed as they were entering Hudson River in the New York. They had to go through Ellis Island, and after 3 or 4 weeks of a very arduous traveling, they would see to their left the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty is very interesting. That meant many different things for the immigrants. I do have a quote here by one immigrant, Stella Petrakis, who actually is the mother of the very famous Greek-American author Harry Mark Petrakis, who says that when she saw, and I quote here, "I felt grateful the Statue of Liberty was a woman. I felt she would understand a woman's heart." And of course, collectively, the Statue of Liberty symbolized America as a welcoming society, as a society ready to accept the immigrants. And in many ways, it symbolized a new beginning. There was this hope coming from small rural areas that migration to America will change one person's life for the better. So it is very interesting then that as we have the Statue of Liberty at the left, and we see here, of course, the immigrants rushing to see it for the first time. At the same time, for those of you who have been in the New York area, as you enter the harbor, to the left is the Statue of Liberty, and to the right is downtown Manhattan. And for the immigrants, that was a site which generated awe, because we have a modern cosmopolitan city with high rises, the skyline is impressive, and in many ways, the Manhattan skyline represented American modernity. represented America as an emerging industrial power who have steel structures and skyscrapers and bridges. So who can imagine then an immigrant coming from a small village in the Peloponnese or from East Thrace and being exposed to two symbols of America in some sense, the Statue of Liberty and American modernity. And that was the first encounter, which in many ways, for many immigrants, as we know from many interviews and from many Greek American stories, exemplified the hope for new beginnings. In many ways then, immigration is a process which initiates, rather a process which is framed with an encounter with a different culture. It's very interesting to see a photograph of a Greek immigrant in 1911, and this photograph I will show you is at the Ellis Island Museum of Immigrant History, and here we see that the immigrants looked and they were dressed very differently. They were marked as foreigner, and we can see here this individual perhaps in his 90s. He was born in 1830 and 1840, so we could expect that he was exposed to stories of the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Turks. So imagine then the tremendous transition that this individual had to do from his own peasant background, wearing his national costume, entering a radically different world. So we can imagine what challenge the new world presented for the Greek peasants, for the Greek immigrants. But it's very interesting, I think, to show you another photograph which exemplifies, it seems to me, that the Greek ethos of dual orientation, the willingness to not to stay within the Greek culture solely, but open up and find out what America had to offer for themselves. And here we see a similar, but also radically different photograph compared to the other one. It's backwards, sorry. The beginnings of a Greek American identity. Here we have then the traditional costume, the national costume, but also we have the derby hat, which in many ways exemplify Western ways. Here we have then the traditional costume, tradition, and we have the Western hat, America lying in front of it. So there is this dual orientation among Greek immigrants, how to adapt and how to enter in a conversation, so to speak, with American culture. Of course, I should say that the first wave of immigrants were mostly men. It was a male-based immigration, and these men were determined to make some money in the United States in any way possible, through working very hard, saving money, but they were determined to return to their villages. They were hoping that they will, for working 5 years, will secure for them a very nice, comfortable retirement in their villages. It didn't happen. A great percentage of the immigrants made America their home. But I think I should mention the lives of these immigrants. This is an experience is not frequently told, and especially the experiences of early immigrants between 1900 and 1910, 1915, who went to western states, states like Utah, Nevada, Arizona, West Virginia, and where they did very heavy labor, where they were really the very core of the process of industrial production. These were people who were laying the railroad tracks, who were getting the ore out of the mines, and they endured very hard living conditions. The pay was very low. The living conditions, everyday living conditions, were appalling, crowded quarters, and many of them died in industrial accidents, and many of them were exploited by the companies because there were so many immigrants willing to take jobs for very low pay. So there was a great deal of supply of labor. And in many ways, the corporations took advantage of this availability, and of course they kept the wages low. We have a great deal, we have a testimony about the life of these immigrants in a book written in 1916 by a Greek journalist. And what is interesting is that this journalist was a woman. Her name was Maria Economidou, who was bold enough in 1916, when the traditional role for a woman was to stay at home. She was bold enough to travel to America. Her husband was the owner of a newspaper in Athens, and he, by herself, he traveled throughout the country, and he met the immigrants in the labor camps, and he wrote a study, «Οι Έλληνες της Αμερικής όπως τους είδα», the Greeks in America as I saw them. And then in this book we have a very interesting account of the hardships of these immigrants. It's very interesting though, taking into consideration the Greek emphasis on appearance. It's very interesting to see that we have here a photograph of 5 young men, and in the caption of the photograph it reads, these people were surviving in a chicken coop, and they were living in a small cottage, and they were surviving on beans and lentils. The immigrants were extremely frugal because their ultimate goal was to save money and go back, and also to fulfill their obligations to their families. You had to provide dowries for the sisters. So in that sense, then, the obligation, the Greek obligation, the honor, the philotimo, that one is not really only working for his own interests, but he works for the interests of the family, was exemplified in this lifestyle where people would sacrifice from the daily lives in order to save money, send money back to Greece, to their families. But it is very interesting that these people were workers. These people were just poorly paid workers who nevertheless dressed in their best, and they had their photograph taken, and they would send these photographs to their families, and they would say, we are doing very well in America. And of course, the villagers in Greece would say, oh, Petros and Takis went there, and in 2 weeks they are dressed in suits and in hats, and they are, where are the mustaches, they would say probably. These people also shaved their mustaches. That was back then very common for Greek men to wear mustaches as a sign of their masculinity. So, and then there were stories starting circulating that America is the place where the streets are paved with gold, and this generated more immigration and more immigration and more rumors about how wonderful life in America, while for these people it really was a difficult adjustment. But nevertheless, this tells us in many ways that appearance is not the only truth. Reality is much more complex than what we see in one photograph. I would like also to show you another picture, which is, to my mind, is a very moving photograph. I should say that there are many dark chapters of not only Greek immigration, but usually dark experiences, negative experiences associated with immigration in general. And these are some of the things that we don't talk about. But I felt that for the sake of these children, I should mention this. Back then, when child labor laws were relaxed, to say the least, there was child labor exploitation. So many Greek immigrants and others would take advantage of children working under very horrible conditions and almost no pay. So here then there is an article written about the Greek bootblack, in Chicago. The Greeks really dominated the business of bootblacking, and children were doing the job. And here what to me is very characteristic. Of course, we know how a bootblack working for 8, 10, or even 12 hours a day, he would be shining shoes, right? And then we will have this movement of the hand. guess what? We see here in the photograph, in some strange way, the photograph capturing this movement of the children working for endless hours. So I felt that this is something that I should share with you. We have, of course, the typical adaptation, the coffee house, the Greek coffee house, dominated by males, of course. That's the traditional Greek culture that, in many ways, excluded women from. Oh, thank you. Participating in public life. Although one should say that also women, Greek immigrant women in the United States, found a very fertile social environment to start demanding their own rights and their right to participate equally in the society. And here we have an owner of a restaurant who was a woman early on. Of course, there is an explanation of traditional Greek culture back 100 years ago, not anymore, of course, but 100 years ago would relegate women to the domestic sphere. Women were not encouraged, sometimes were not allowed to work outside the house. But what happened? Many immigrant women married much older Greek immigrants. It was not uncommon for a 50 or 60-year-old Greek immigrant who made it to America to marry a 19, 20-year, most probably poor girl from Greece, who, without dowry, who had to come to America to find a much older husband. So, of course, what happened after 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years, the husband died, and then the woman, still in her 30s and 40s, was much more independent and had the opportunity to start her own enterprise. I think that we should examine immigration in its social context. In other words, to what extent the host society is welcoming or perhaps reserved towards the immigrants. And these attitudes change, of course, through time. But I think we should mention that back in the 20th century, early in the 20th century, we have two dominant approaches. On the one hand, we have the notion that we all know America is an opening society, and here we have very symbolically the fact that American society is open to everyone. And of course, we also discuss the economic dimension, that America needed labor in order to support its own industrial growth. So on the one hand, then, we had the welcoming of the immigrant, but at the same time, we had a great deal for assimilation. Here we have the notion of the melting pot, the notion that the immigrants should, once they have decided to come to America, they should totally forget their culture and they should melt into the new American citizen. We can imagine the concerns of many officials and the people in the United States having to confront 20 million different people coming to the country within 30 years. So there was a massive influx of people who looked very different. There was a great deal of reflection on whether this immigration is for the good of the country or it might affect it negatively. The one theory was that the immigrants are welcomed, but nevertheless they should forget their old ways and they should assimilate. And here, of course, and we have the other extreme response, which in many ways was associated with a very strong and revived Ku Klux Klan, which in many ways directed itself against the immigrants. We have instances where Greeks and other Southeastern Europeans were attacked, and there was a great deal of movement towards restricting immigration. There was this notion that Southeastern Europeans are not equally intelligent as Northern Europeans. It was this notion which was not an isolated point of view. It really circulated in magazines like the National Geographic or in universities like Yale University and Harvard University. The notion that Southeastern European immigrants are mentally inferior and racially inferior from the dominant culture. And there was then this tremendous movement towards restricting immigration, which I should say this movement was very successful when in 1924 there was the new immigration policy which really shut down the door to the Southeastern European immigrants, including Greeks. So after 1924, and between 1924 and 1964, when we have the changes in immigration law, there is very little Greek immigrants coming to America. What I should say is that the Greeks understood very early on, compared to other immigrant groups, that in order to be accepted in American society, they have to enter in a conversation, so to speak, with American culture. In other words, they have to take into consideration what were the criteria for acceptance in this society. Greeks associated themselves with a very illustrious past. They have their philotimo, they have the sense of honor, and they felt humiliated when they saw signs in restaurants, I quote, "No Greeks or rats allowed." For them, and for those of you who have read George Leber's Order of Achepa, the history of the Order of Achepa, he recalls himself in Milwaukee as a child of immigrants, walking down the main street and seeing this kind of signs and feeling very ashamed on the one hand that he was Greek, but at the same time feeling very angry. So, in other words, Greeks felt humiliated and they reacted very strategically. I would like to mention here the profound understanding Achepa showed towards the socio-historical context of dominant attitudes towards the immigrants in general. Here we have, of course, well, Achepa has been to some extent controversial because some people would say that it embraced 100% Americanism. I will not touch this controversy, but I would say that Achepa profoundly understood that it was not enough for Greek immigrants to say that we are the ancestors of the ancients, therefore you should accept us the way we are. Achepa understood very clearly that in order to be accepted in this society, you have somehow to achieve socioeconomically. You have to be a store owner, you have to show that you can show self-discipline, that you are fit for citizenship, that your kids go to school and embrace the language and the culture. So Achepa's response was systematically an answer to those who argued that Greeks are not fit for citizenship and they are, quote unquote, again, they're brutal foreigners. So Achepa then played a very, very strategic role in really reorienting Greek immigrants from Greece towards the United States. It is very interesting that it adopted the identity American Hellene. It was not a Greek immigrant anymore, it was American Hellene. And again, I think in this designation, we have a very astute movement because back then, hyphenated identities were not accepted. To be a hyphenated ethnic, something that we accept now, it meant back then that your loyalties are split, that your loyalty is not 100% for America. Therefore, hyphenated identities back then were suspicious. Therefore, Achepa, very interestingly, changed the designation to an American Hellene, exemplifying its orientation towards the new home, America, and also the ancient Greeks, which were not associated with any nation state, any country. So very, very skillfully then, they negotiated their position. I saw in the corridor that there was an Achepa convention here in 1928, I believe, or 1929. Of course, there were there are conventions everywhere. Here is from Columbus, Ohio. We see, of course, signs of allegiance to America everywhere. We see the American flags. Back then, it was inconceivable to have an American and a Greek flag side by side the way now Greek festivals, for example, have it. And here we have people who are very well dressed, and they are really building a future in the United States. Of course, as many of you perhaps you remember, for many immigrant parents, HEPA conventions were a wonderful opportunity for their sons and daughters to meet eligible spouses. And this is very interesting in itself, because as we see HEPA having an orientation towards Americanizing itself, at the same time we have an emphasis also of marrying within the group. That's a very interesting tension here. And again, in many ways, it exemplifies the dual tension. We are Americans, but at the same time, we'd like our sons and daughters to marry Greek. Something which we see now, 100 years later, is changing rapidly, as the Greek Archdiocese tells us that 8 out of 10 weddings taking place within the church are interfaith, inter-ethnic marriages. 7 out of 10. So this was then the first real challenge for the Greeks, for the Greek immigrants, the challenge to convince mainstream society that they could be positive contributors to the American society. And they were able to do that by building this sense that the Greeks could be successful, something that is with us until today. I'm sorry, how much time do I have? It seems
I'm enjoying you. I don't know.
Yeah, I know, but
Take your about 2:15. What time is it? About 10 minutes.
I'm sorry?
About 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay. Greek sociability, just another photograph I enjoy. Probably an immigrant was able to buy a car, and this photograph, I think, is very indicative of an orientation of the Greeks towards valuing being with others, extended relative networks, friends. They get together, the communities Greek immigrants build around their churches. Nevertheless, we see here one, perhaps the wonderment of the immigrant being able to buy a car and probably the community going for a picnic. I mentioned the churches. I should also underline the central role of the Greek Orthodox Church in Greek immigrant adaptation. In many ways, churches energized a community-centered spirit. For example, in Columbus, the community was able to build a church in the early 1920s by $15,000, which were donated back then by a Greek immigrant. $15,000 back in early 1900 was unbelievably large amount of money. But nevertheless, this shows that an individual was willing to give his hard-earned money for the community. And there is this then investment towards building a community, building a church, which has created what I call a Greek American ethos. The support for the community, that community in many ways is not only a spiritual, religious center, but is also a social and educational center. It is very important not only for individuals, but for the community itself. So we have then an orientation towards not only thinking about our own personal well-being, but also thinking about the well-being of others. I should also say that from my experience in Columbus, of course, in the pattern in Greek America has been that Greeks did not coalesce for a long time around in one ethnic neighborhood. Once they started making money, they moved to the suburbs. So that was another strategy for assimilation and acculturation. They did not really create enclaves where they felt comfortable among themselves, but they really opened up and they tried to participate in mainstream culture as much as possible. So I should say that the community life was, of course, very important for them, but it did not totally determine their lifestyle. Immigrants, and more importantly, their sons and daughters, were able to participate in mainstream and also have their community as another social place, religious center, to find meaning and support it. But it did not really create a closed community. The Greek American community has been open to acculturation and assimilation in many ways. The notorious Greek school, the churches, I have heard stories and stories of the sons and daughters of immigrants hating to be in school, very authoritative teachers. The kids wanted to play baseball, and the kids, by going to the school, were singled out as foreigners, and the kids were teasing them for having to go to immigrant schools. This is an institution, of course, the Greek school, which has changed considerably throughout the years, but nevertheless, it tells us that, again, on the one hand, we have an opening to the mainstream society. At the same time, we have the parents really forcing, encouraging, forcing, the consensus is forcing the children to attend. I thought, of course, I also, I did my work on Greek language school, and I know nowadays also children want to go and play soccer rather than go to school once a week. But nevertheless, there is also the realization now, I have been in Columbus for 10 years, and now I speak to young people that I used to teach, and they say, I wish I had paid more attention to learning the language. So we have, again, the fact that ethnicity is not something constant, that it changes throughout an individual's life cycle. At some age, people may want to explore their roots or their culture for whatever reasons. The post-1960s saw a tremendous changes in Greek America, demographic as well as economic. Here we have from our community here an article, a newspaper article conveying to the citizens of Columbus that the Greek community is changing. We have Mr. Tom Chase, but which perhaps some of you know him. I always a delight to talk with him, and we have, of course, Father Saris, who used to be the priest at the time. But what we have here in the post-1960s, we have the American society changing and seeing itself as a multicultural, a multi-ethnic society, where it is okay to be an American, but also to feel some connection with your ethnic roots. So since the 1960s then, we have a gradual shift from the emphasis to assimilation to a tolerance or acceptance of some kind of difference. I should mention that this is, of course, the Greek community in Columbus was able to build a very impressive cathedral, which cost lots of money. It was a multi-million-dollar project, and in many ways, here we see the people who made it possible. These are the people who were the council back then. But I have talked to many of them, and for them it was a momentous time in their lives. Why? Because they, as sons and daughters of immigrants who were working as busboys or in the restaurants, or they had little stores, within one generation, the sons and daughters were able to fund this very expensive project and build a new cathedral, the ethnic church, next to the immigrant church. So for them, in many ways, the new cathedral was the sign, the symbol that Greek Americans have made it socioeconomically. And they were able to construct a very impressive building in the heart, very close to the heart of downtown Columbus. Not a small accomplishment. And they felt understandably very proud. And again, here, how were they able to finance this project? One was through individual contributions, and another, of course, a huge fundraiser for the Columbus community has been the Greek Festival. So again, we see after 70 years, the orientation towards investing to the community is still strong among Greek Americans. The festival had a humble beginnings. This is from the early photographs from the Columbus Festival. People remember that they were trying to attract people by being in the corners and distributing flyers. Many people came early in the beginning. Many immigrants were also very reluctant, and they felt that it was, let me use the word, weird or bizarre, that they had somehow to downplay their ethnicity. Many immigrants tried to assimilate, and they did not display their ethnicity. They wouldn't speak Greek in the supermarket, for example. They would speak Greek at home. But then for them, it was hard to understand that the society that until then had somehow forced them to assimilate, now it was willing to enjoy Greek dances and Greek food. But nevertheless, with the input of many people who had the vision that American society was changing, there was this then festival which grew to a very large event. Now it is considered a Columbus attraction. And here what we see, what made perhaps the Greek festival successful, Greeks did in the festival successfully what they were doing successfully in their businesses. They were restaurant owners, they were cooks, they were cooking for the restaurant, they were running business, they had the expertise to organize a festival. They were reserving their dances in their social halls, and they were able to take their dances from their basement of the churches and perform them in the parking lots, and they enjoyed a great deal of popularity. It is backwards. So here then, increasingly, we have an appreciation of now displaying and performing your ethnicity. Kids are not ashamed anymore to say that we are Greek Americans. There is no social stigma attached to it. And also I should mention that the popularity of Greek festivals in many ways is due also to the popularity of the film Zorba the Greek. And we have here a very interesting parallel. We see a photograph of Anthony Quinn dancing Zeybekiko with a background of the Cretan landscape. Many American citizens saw this film. And then in the Greek festival, they could go in their backyard, so to speak, and they could enjoy Zorba-like performances. And these are three new immigrants. In the post-60s, we have a new wave of immigration, which really culturally revitalized the community. Nevertheless, we have here three individuals, men, somehow performing Zorba the Greek for the festival visitors. Again, then the social context in the post-60s America facilitated the notion that ethnicity is something which is positive. Exploring our roots is wonderful. It does not contradict the notion that one can be an American and a Greek. And again, this context gave rise to an interesting then coexistence between a national identity and also an ethnic identity. I think Greek America faces a challenge in many ways. Greek America has made it to the mainstream. We have George Tenet, the son of Greek immigrants, being the director of CIA. We have George Stephanopoulos being the right hand of an American president. We have Michael Dukakis running for president. We have Olympia Dukakis being an actress. So in many ways, Greek Americans now are in the mainstream of American culture. And there is this now reflection, we have made it in the mainstream. To quote one Greek American, we have become super Americans. Now what? There is a critical juncture here, and there is a very explicit effort to explore ways where Greek heritage and Greek culture can be a meaningful cultural resource that will go beyond the gyro syndrome, as they call it, that in many ways, are you familiar with it? In many ways, the Greek American ethnicity is primarily expressed through dances and food, which is, of course, wonderful, but when our children ask us in what way Greek culture is relevant in my life, when spouses who are not Greek come and join our communities, and they perhaps will ask us, why should my kid learn Greek? Or why should my kid go to learn Greek history? What is it in the Greek culture that really can enrich an individual life? There will be questions that we have to face, and to me, the greatest challenge is, as Greek Americans, to think of ways to say that our heritage has a real relevance for America. From education to how we understand history, from politics to how we understand our past, from how our memories and immigrant values could be transmitted to our children without being imposed on them, how we will engage with tradition and say this traditional aspect perhaps does not work, oppresses, let's get rid of it. But this traditional aspect is beneficial for our families. This kind of sorting is something I think that we need to consider very carefully in order to promote Greek culture as a meaningful cultural resource that can make a difference in American society. I could go on and on, but I have to stop. I really thank you very, very much for the invitation, and I will be more than happy to talk to you after the presentation. Thank you.
We have some time set up for a panel discussion. At the end of the panel discussion, if you have any questions, we can ask the panel members. Just as a way of a short introduction of what we are going to do here, in 1903, there was only one Greek registered business in Dayton. That was a confectionery on 5th Street owned by Frank Karumpas. By 2000, we had hundreds of Greek-owned businesses registered in Dayton. They range from restaurants, medical practices, legal practices, just ran the whole gambit of the type of businesses. What this exhibit portrays, and hopefully the panel will illustrate, is how we got to where we are today. Quite frankly, we're trying to say what happened in Dayton community in the 1900s. By 1910, there were approximately 15 Greek families in Dayton, and they began to think of Greek school, Orthodox religion, and in order to do that, they grouped together. By 1921, there were about 65 Greek families. They raised $5,000 and bought the church that was down on Roberts Boulevard. Over the next 40 years, we also witnessed the formation and chartering of many organizations, such as 1923, the GAPA Men and Women were chartered, 1926, AHEPA, 34 was GAPA Young Women, 42 was Daughters, and 59 was the Maids. The 1930s saw the rise of the Greek neighborhoods that centered around the church on Roberts Boulevard. In 1931 was the first Bible study, which is the forerunner of our Sunday school. Now, the interesting thing about that is it was not actually part of the church budget until 1951, so it was just done within the community people themselves. Now, by the 1940s, the immigrants began to prosper and were established enough that they branched into various parts of Dayton because they no longer required the safety net of the closed community. By 1943, the land in which the current church stands was purchased. In Easter week of 1951 was the first service. And it wasn't until 1955 that the Archdiocese finally published textbooks for Sunday school in English. Before that, it was totally in Greek. Sunday school has really flourished in the Dayton community to today where we have over 200 students registered. Today, there are over 500 families in the Greek church, and they are all an integral part of the Dayton community. This was no accident. From the beginning, the Greek immigrants' goal was to fit in. They did not want to become just Greek Americans, but they wanted to become Americans of Greek descent. I'd like now to turn it over to our panel members and explain just how this happened. Judge Ganaris will talk about the overall community in the 1930s. Greg Karras will talk about specific neighborhood influence. Katie Scott will talk about some social activities and organizations. Bill Pangus will talk about the businesses in Dayton. And finally, Demit Zonars will talk about what the children of the immigrants have done since then.
Let's move this over so they can see.
I'll get it.
Doctor, on an original question, please. It seems to me that in Dayton, Ohio, up until 1930, most of the immigrants that came to this country were from Thrace in that area. Is that true also for the rest of the United States?
No, I don't think so. No, we have people of certain regional affiliation clustered into particular pockets because they follow their families and other immigrants. So we have people from the Peloponnese, for example, focusing on Chicago.
Well, the reason I ask that is because I feel, my memory tells me that the immigrants here in Dayton, Ohio came from the Thrace area. And I think that was because of 1915, 14, 13, and so forth, getting ready for the First World War. People in that area who lived under the Turkish rule, for example, my father was drafted by the Turkish army around that time, and then, as was the case, he was able, or his family was able to pay $200 and secure a discharge. He went home and started working again, and 2 months later, here they come again, they're going to draft him. And he said, the heck with that. Somehow he found himself on a boat and ends up in Ellis Island, coming to Dayton, Ohio, because his friend Floris Stamati was here in Dayton, and he ends up at Union Station, gets off the train, and he's going to find Floris with no phone number, no address or anything. And he walks across Ludlow Street at 6th, comes north on Ludlow, and halfway up the block there's a restaurant and there's a window, and he looks in there, and what do you know? Oh. There's Floris Stamati. They must stay, and Floris, and hugs and kisses and so forth. What would you like to eat? My father said, his first day in the United States. He said, I don't know. He says, why don't you try this ham? The first time my father has some smoked ham, and he made faces, and it sure wasn't keftedes or anything like that. But anyway, let me talk about the 30s because they're going to stop me. I have so much time only. In 1930s in Dayton, Ohio, the sun was brighter, the clouds were wider, the skies were bluer. Maybe there wasn't as much pollution, or maybe it was because my eyesight was better. But in any event, things were always happening in Dayton, and the economic situation was better here than in most cities. Before the involvement in World War II, it was known as the city of 1,000 stacks. That means 1,000 factories. With the entrance into the Second World War, more jobs were created. So the financial climate of our area lured many immigrants to Dayton, and many of them being Greeks who followed their early patrioti, and as a result, here we are. The more things change, the more they seem to be the same. So it seems. In February of 1931, it was erected by the Dayton Journal-Herald to the Keys Theater on West 4th Street between Main and Ludlow to see Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford in The Taming of the Shrew. At the Main Company on East 5th Street, one could purchase a grand piano for $99 or a phonograph for $9.85, and Reich's department store men could buy a suit with 2 pairs of pants for $45. New Chevrolet Roadster was $495, and you could have it washed for 95 cents. On the sports pages, which were there was the announcement that one of the 2 great Greek wrestlers of the day, General John Kilonis, was known as the Greek Tiger Man, was to wrestle Bill Montana at Memorial Hall on February 9th, 1930. The other Greek wrestler, Jim Londos, was referred to by all the Greeks as Jeems Londos. Jeems, Jeems. Right. And then at the Dayton Art Institute was given to the city of Dayton by Julia Shaw Carnell. There were many theaters, stores of all kinds, and restaurants in Dayton, and our ancestors were involved with many of them. But the center of activity then, as is now, was the Greek Orthodox Church, the Evangelismos tis Theotokos, that means the Annunciation, located at 15 South Robert Boulevard on a small lot with no parking lot, and you'll see a picture of it here somewhere. And this was just south of 3rd Street, near the bridge, and within the 5-block area were 90 Greek families. Most not having automobiles would walk to church for service and other events. It seems as if everyone knew everyone else. There were no strangers, and every adult was your Theo, uncle, or Thea, aunt. By 1935 through 1940, many of these near the church residents would move to other locations such as Dayton View, Riverdale, Oakwood, and so forth. For those growing up in the 30s and the 40s, it was a time of excitement, fun, and closeness. It was a time of growing up in our ethnic community and the Dayton community at large. From Monday through Friday, there was involvement in school activities. On Saturdays and Sundays, there were Greek church functions where we socialized with fellow first-generation young Americans. Also, ethnic-centered organizations such as AHEPA and GAPA, along with church-sponsored events such as picnics, were created and more opportunities to meet one another. I'll cut some of this out because it was too long. Let's see, where will I go now? Okay, right across the boulevard from the church was Proctor Street. The first house on the left is where Chris and Mary Karras with their children Greg, Fiona, and Nicholas and Everett lived at 259. Across the street was the Purity Ice Cream Company. You remember the Purity Ice Cream Company? And it was owned and operated by Jim and Ted Dimitrios' father, George. In those days, no one called him George. He was known to all the Greeks as Ice Krimas. That's right. Who Ice Krimas, the ice cream man. Thank you. On Proctor, also, was John Apostle's family, the George Eustath clan, and the George Steffens family. Dr. Fofo Spiridon and his parents were at 227, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Afadoulis at 225, and Ernest George at 223. At 104 Proctor Street lived Dino Ganaris' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Perry. In this area, at 40 Maple Street lived Socrates and Aristide Stamety with their girls Tony, Mary, and Mel. At 225 Proctor, Alex and Penelope Afadoulis were raising their children. Overlooking all this was the Greek church on an elevated lot near the river. Today, this area of Proctor, West 4th, and Maple Streets is now occupied by the extensive and beautiful Sinclair Community College. Mr. Gus Michael, father of Pete and Nick, worked with the Zonars brothers and lived in South Dayton. Pete and Theodora George lived on Syracuse. In 1930, Bill Theodoros, as general chairman of the Retail Grocers and Butchers Association, announced a Valentine's party for the community to be held on February 10th. Mr. Theodoros operated a grocery store on North Dayton. His daughter Mary later became an outstanding osteopathic practitioner in Dayton. Also in 1930, the sports pages raved about bowler Tom Zavakis and the exploits on the alleys of Otto Zavakis and Pete Zavakis and Connie Zavakis. Now we go on to West 2nd Street, right across the bridge. John Panesis lived there and his family. At 1018, we would find Mr. and Mrs. Triffin Bukavalis raising their nephew Bill. At 1019, we find Stati and Panayota Veridin and their children Plato and Dimitra. And also we would find Mr. and Mrs. Nick Gazettis and the family of Nick Christ. At 33 Grimes Street, again across the river, lived Demosthenes and Kiki, my parents. And at that time, with me and my brother Dino, further out on West 3rd, Demosthenes Ganeris operated the West End grocery store, and assisting him was Floros Staminy, the guy he came to visit. And shortly, Mr. Floros Staminy and his wife, Helen, and their children, Stamati, Nick, and Mary, would move to Cincinnati. In Dayton View, Gus and Demetrius Stamatakis lived at 935 Five Oaks and had 3 children, Stratty, Louis, and Joan died at an early age. Socrates and Oreste lived at 40 Maple. Excuse me. Mr. Louis Prionis from Thessaly was president of the Bluebird Pie Company, which at that time was located at 704 Salem Avenue. Mr. Prionis asked my father in those days, he said, why don't you come into business with me? And Pop said no. He told me about this in the 40s. Pop, what the hell's the matter with you? Well, anyway, we would never did get in the pie business. Now, the Zonars brothers, John, Harry, and Constantine, along with Florida's brothers, Floris and Nick, had a confectionery store at 10 South Main Street. Harry and Avanthea were also living in Dayton, and he was the president of the Charles Zonar's confectionery store at 5th and Ludlow. Constantine and Penelope Zonars were the parents of Little Demit. We're Little Demit's here somewhere. Right Big Demit's parents were John and Ephrosine Zonars. Mr. and Mrs. Harry Zonars were the parents of Marie, Dola, and Paul. Paul would later marry Daphne, and they would become the parents of Thea Balasiadis and Lloyd Johnson. Christophorus and Chrissy Theodos lived at 220 Shaw with their children, Theodore and Harriet. They grew up in Oakwood, and during the Second World War, Theodore was killed in action in the Pacific. In 1931, we find Mr. and Mrs. Constantine Zonars at 127 Aberdeen. Mr. and Mrs. Sam Carubas lived on Babbitt Street, and Mr. Carubas in the 30s and most of the 40s had a little candy wagon located at 3rd and Main Streets. Remember? Yes. In downtown Dayton on the sidewalk in front of the courthouse, and this was a concession by the city to the Spanish-American War veteran. His caramel apples were the best in town. George and Evangeline Economides lived at Telford in Oakwood, and he had a restaurant in 31 South Ludlow Street. Gus and Cleo Economides lived at Hadley Street, and Mr. Gus Economides operated his shoe store at 1907 East 3rd Street, and my father would always take me there to get the shoes. Gus and Cleo Economides had 3 daughters and a son, Lula, Chrysula, Betty, and Dimitri. Alex and Mary Boyer lived at 141 West Herman, and with their children, Ernest and Eva. The Pandeli brothers' deli was located on West 5th, and the Spiros Pandeli restaurant at West 5th also. Michael Pappas had a grocery store on West 5th. Back on Maple Street near the church, John Cababas and his family had their home. The George Maduris family lived at 202 and Marie Zaharas at 209. Apostolos Cababas and his wife, Anna, lived at 212 and had 4 sons, John, Perry, Nick, and Dino. How we doing? Keeping time? The Peter Liris family was located on Maple, and nearby on West 4th Street at 11619 were the Charles Zonars Company, candy manufacturers. Tom Simopoulos with his wife, Kia, and their children, Ann, Nick, and... Well, I'm going to take some extra time, I'll tell you that. Ann, Nick, and Rosie Lee lived on West 4th Street. Also in 1931, at 19 McDaniel Street, lived Constantine Esmaro Maraglu. Also on Floral were the Karases and the Socrates family, parents of, and now also on Floral, Peter and Stamatina Mellis had moved to Dayton from Chicago with their children, Sam, Helen, and Spiridula. Near there on Floral Avenue were Mr. and Mrs. Kakis with their children, George, Jenny, and Bertie, Sue, and Chris. Peter Lahanas, who later had the G&L restaurant on Salem Avenue, and the Jim Apostles family could be found at 311 McDaniel Street. Chris Zavakis and his wife Stella lived at Ellesmere with their children, Angelo, Tula, and Socrates. At this time, Mr. Zavakis operated the billiard room on North Main Street. George and Mary Zavakis had the Lyric and Soda Grill. George and Constantina Zavakis lived on Rockwood. Mr. Zavakis operated and was president of the Royal Bowling Alley. Mr. Louis Zavakis and his wife lived on Ellesmere. Otto Zavakis on Row. Peter Zavakis and his wife on Neal. Mr. Pangus and his wife Bettina lived on McDaniel Street. He operated the Capital Restaurant. Their children, Bill and Joy, are still living in Dayton. Around the corner of McDaniel Street lived Mr. and Mrs. Pete Lavis with their children, Spiro and Sue. In the mid-30s and 40s, the young people of the church delighted in going to Greek picnics, whether they were associated, sponsored, or the church. And Mr. Harry Zonars, with a white shirt and a tie and a straw hat, would gather all the children around, and then from his candy store, he would bring all this wrapped candy, throw them in the air, and everybody would scramble. That was the fun part. One of the Zonars brothers moved back to Athens, Greece, with his experience in the candy and soda fountain business, established the famous Zonars Confectionery just off of Constitution Square, and I'm sure a lot of you have been there. It was such a success that imitators can be found all around Constitution Square. There was a series of 3 movies some years ago, 10, 12 years ago, about Benji. Benji was a little cute dog. You remember that? Yeah. In the 3rd movie, Benji, he's in Athens, Greece, and the guy that he's walking around with looks at somebody else, and they have a conversation, and then he says, meet you at Zonars. Anybody remember that? Yeah. Okay. In 1936, Sam and Helen Karras were at Wilby Avenue, and Mr. Karras was the manager owner of Sam's Lunch. On and on and on. On 2nd Street, Athanasios and Bukiria Jonathan with the children, Helen and Constantine there. Yeah, the brothers Stan and Steve, Chris and Jim brought their families, established restaurants, and were all successful. Jim and Mary Stamus were the parents of Paul, Georgia Iris, Helen, Tina, and Tony. Steve and Mary were the parents of Charlie and Donia, Eva, John, and Nick. Peter, Emily, and Mary. Mr. Gregory, John Gregory, operated the Far Hills Theater. They had 2 children, Marina and Ted. Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Davis raised their children, Nick, Pete, and Basula. And at Dayton View, Mr. and Mrs. James Leakus lived with their 3 children, Renee, Ted, and Ann. Mr. Leakus, a furrier, came to Dayton at the request of Mr. David Reich to head Reich's Fur Department. He later started his own fur establishment. Also in that decade, Mr. and Mrs. Tom Manoff operated a restaurant on East 3rd Street, Lula. You all call her Lulu? It was Lula. Lula Castro is one of their daughters. By 1940, the Greek ghetto was no more as people moved to other parts of the city. On the 4th of July, we all like to go to the lakeside and watch the fireworks. All in all, it was an interesting, exciting time for those growing up in Dayton and with Dayton. It was a time of innocence that was shattered by the Second World War, but still a time to remember. Thank you. All right.
Did you leave anything?
Now you get the audio visual aid. Now, as the judge was speaking about General Dayton, this, I am taking a small segment of that, and this is Lower Riverdale. You know it now as McPherson Town, the historic McPherson Town. Of course, then it wasn't very historic. Now, just to give you a little idea of where this is situated. Up here is I-75, comes down through here like this. Art Institute, Greek Orthodox Church, Masonic Temple here. Here's Riverview Avenue, which goes right into the Art Institute. So you get an idea of where McPherson Town and Lower Riverdale was. Over here was North Main Street. Now, the candy stripes in these areas are Greek homes in this 3-block area. Now, All of these folks in here lived in this area, except the foreigner behind there. Admit he didn't live in this area. We all lived in this area. We grew up in this area. Now, why did, to take a look at this community here, Lower Riverdale, our parents that came over here came from Greece, naturally, many parts of Greece. Why did they come to Dayton, Ohio? Well, first of all, they left Greece for one reason, to make money, as the good doctor said, to go back to Greece. 99% of them probably wanted to go back and raise their family. My dad came over, he had two sisters. His father died at an early age. He was 14 years old and working in the olive groves, making nothing. Now, how are you going to give a plica to two sisters? So Mom sends him to America to meet an uncle, which he didn't know. Now remember, 14, 15-year-old, you're going to get on a ship, you're going to go to America, and you're going to meet an uncle that you probably never met. And you couldn't speak English. Now he gets off the boat at Hoboken, New Jersey, and he waits. And he waits. And he waits. Finally, an uncle shows up. He said it was a day late. I don't think it was that long. And he took him, and they went to work. Washing dishes, shining shoes. Now, I'll tell you the story why he left there. The uncle's son says to him, take this nickel and go over to the drugstore and buy some spare ribs. Now, my dad takes the nickel, goes to the drugstore. He goes to the drug and says, spare ribs, here's the nickel. He says, no, 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 son, you've got to go to the grocery store. Kind of hits my dad in the head. He goes over to the grocery store, buys the spare ribs, goes back to his uncle and the kids, and throws them at him in the left. He joined the Army at 17, went to Georgia, where he became a soldier, became a cook, got his citizenship, went back after the war to Greece, married my mother. Now, my mother was not, she was from soy. My dad was a farm boy. My mom's father was a pharmacist. Her brother was a pharmacist. The other brother was a writer. My dad was a farm boy. They came to Greece. Now, why did they come to Dayton, Ohio? It's a guess. His uncles and some of the friends had restaurants there. So he came, worked at the Royal Bowling Alley in one of the restaurants, bought the place right across the street on 5th Street, a little restaurant. He worked there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we lived on this part of Floral Avenue. Well, later on, we had to move to Welby Street, which was right back here where the Sir Medicis owned that. Right behind Kramer's Bakery. Ah, Kramer's Bakery. I can remember the days we'd walk in there with a nickel and say, Mr. Kramer, as he came out of the back room, no shirt on, hairy chest. What did you want, son? I'll have a cream puff. Those cream puffs were delicious. Very good. Well, anyway, then from Wilby Street, my dad finally bought down here. And right across the street, where the Calcuses rented up above, John Calcus and his wife rented up right above the palace, Steve Palace. Katie Marglew, right here, she lived. Right there, with her sister. You come up the street, there was Florence's store. Now, Florence knew all of the Greeks around here, and later became Thompson's store, so she could kind of help along. Now, remember, our parents didn't know, especially our mothers, no English. So when they went, of course, they had to point and they'd buy. Our dads all learned. Now remember, none of them had more than a 4th grade education, except Artemby Capers. My dad said he was smart. He went to high school. Very good in mathematics. The rest of them were very, very fortunate they went past the 4th or 5th grade. But every one of them learned to write and speak and read English without a tutor, without school education. Now that shows you something. They had brains. Well, anyway, then up here, we came up in here. Here was Chris Dale lived there, and Hank Polis lived right over here. Across the street were the Pavlakuses, the Cakuses, the Mellises, the Graffuses. Came over here, here's where Sam Karumbas lived. Now see this alley through here? That was no man's land. All the kids from the Stamatakuses to the Mellises, the Cakus would come down the alley to meet down here with the Karases and the Ganarises so we could go to McKinley Park to play or play in the river. River. Oh, they only knew. And the reason we came down the back street is because the lots were big and there were garages and moms and dads couldn't see us going because they had a network. If one found out, everyone down the line knew they're coming. So after the periods of playing and so forth and so on, we all attended Hawthorne School, which is now an apartment building. It was a historic building, so they couldn't tear it down. That was our school, our elementary school. We had all went to the elementary school. Then when we grew up, and we caught the bus over here to go to Colonel White, which was Fairview High School in Colonel White. Go off the street, way up, catch the bus there. There were no school buses at that time. We put our 3 cents in and would go all the way up to the high school. Now, what happened to all of these kids in here? Just to give you an idea, there were 20, I've got the figures here so I wouldn't forget. There were 22 boys in this area and 15 girls. 16 of the boys graduated from college. 2 of them were professors. Louis Stamatakis was voted the outstanding college professor in graduate studies at Michigan State University. Taiki Cakus teaches at Bowling Green University. We had 2 engineers. Bill Pangus lived right over here, had patents at General Motors and at NCR Corporation. Down here, Judge Ganaris was voted the presiding judge of Montgomery County Probate Court. Out of here, we had 8 educators, 2 physicians. My younger brother became a doctor, graduated #1 in his class at the University of Louisville, also had a football scholarship down there, played with Johnny Unitas. Katie Marglou was the only girl to go to college. My brother Louis was a retired colonel, went to the University of Dayton, and of course when he graduated from the university he went right to Korea and came back, thank God, retired as lieutenant colonel. I graduated from Miami University, became a principal in a Dayton school system, and I was very fortunate to be selected as the exemplary principal of the state of Ohio. At that time. So as you see, as you go through here and you see what did these young men do? Well, if it wasn't for mom and dad, now mom and dad didn't sit down and say, you're going to go to college. There was never a question. We knew we were going to go to college. What college were you going to go to? That was the problem. Now, mom and dad never sat down and took out the pamphlets and so forth and said, look at this university, this is what you're going to take. You sat down, you wrote everything that you had to, you filled it out, you sent it in. Of course, you asked for the money to send in. You sent the money in, and you either accepted or rejected. We were all accepted. And let me ask you a question now. What kind of course selection would you do? I mean, we had no knowledge of what to sit down and take. If you were going to be a doctor or a lawyer, you did it on your own. Now, all of that came about because of the fathers and mothers that were eager to make a good living. And they passed that on to their kids. And their kids passed it on to their kids. Now, for my kids, I was very fortunate to have 3 children. One's an attorney. One's the principal at J.F. Kennedy Elementary School in Kettering, and my daughter is a school teacher. Now that's very, very much what happened in all of our families. All because mom and dad worked hard at making us a success. And we did very well. Thank you.
That is a tough act to follow. I'm going to talk a little bit about the social activities and education of the early Dayton families here in, early Greek families here in Dayton. The social life of the Greek people in Dayton in the 1920s and 30s centered around the church. And we hear this over and over. There were two main organizations, GAPA, which is an acronym for Greek American Progressive Association, and AHEPA, which is an acronym for American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. The function of these groups was to preserve Greek customs within the American framework. Both of these groups eventually had men's, women's, girls, and boys chapters. And these organizations sponsored meetings, dances. They would put on plays and other social events such as teas and banquets. The plays evolved into pageants for the celebration of Greek Independence Day, with young men dressed as Evzones and young women in costume as well. As a little girl, I remember reciting long, epic poems at these pageants. The groups would frequently raise money for the church and donated substantial sums toward the building of our present church. AHEPA and the Daughters of Penelope are still viable today, and of course, AHEPA is a sponsor, and the Daughters of Penelope are providing refreshments today. The women's chapter of GAPA is still active in the community. Another important organization was Philoptochos. This is the philanthropic arm of the church and was not only philanthropic but social as well. This organization is still very active today, and all the young women in the church over the age of 18 are part of it. Name days, which are the feast days of the saint for whom a person is named, were celebrated far more than birthdays. These were occasions when people would visit each other's homes, somewhat like an open house to celebrate, and the parties would last all day. For example, if it was St. Gregory's Day, St. Gregory's Day, it would not be uncommon to go visit Gregory Karas, maybe Gregory Spiros, and then maybe Gregory Ceremetis. And although there was a plethora of food and drink, rarely did anyone become intoxicated. I think that they believed in the idea of moderation in all things. Also, the children always accompanied the parents. In the 1920s and 30s, when the community was relatively new, everyone was invited to all of the weddings. These were family affairs, and the receptions were usually held in one of the halls owned by GAPA or AHEPA. I recall a hall on South Jefferson Street and one on East 5th Street, but those buildings are no longer there. Again, food and drink were abundant, and there was much Greek dancing. Sometimes there was a Victrola for scratchy music, but often there were live musicians providing the entertainment. On a more informal level, because many families lived in close proximity, we would go to each other's homes to visit or play cards. The entire family would go, and the children would get to know each other very well. These were extended families, and the parents became godparents and kubati to each other's children. In the afternoons, after their housework was done, and few women at that time worked outside the home, the women would visit each other's homes for coffee. Usually, along with the Greek coffee, koulouria or kouroubiadis were served, and a spoonful of rose jelly and a glass of ice water were also part of the refreshments. One very big social event was the annual picnic. In the very beginning, the picnics were held in various places, but I remember them being in the pavilion at Triangle Park. There was baseball, games for children, music, and each family would bring their own food. Judge Ganaris mentioned Mr. Zonar's throwing candy out, and that was a highlight for me too. I thought that was heaven. Here was this candy being thrown, for anybody. This activity was the forerunner of our present festival. Because most of our parents had limited formal education, And because they had to work so hard to provide for their families, they had the vision that their children should become well educated in this wonderful land of opportunity so that their lives would be easier. When I started school, I knew very little English because we spoke only Greek at home, and most of my playmates were also Greek. The transition for me was very easy, and I became a good student. My parents expected me to get A's. However, they were never involved in my homework, nor did they ever ask me whether I had completed it. That was my responsibility. So I had a smile when Greg was talking about, what course should you take? You didn't get any guidance from your parents. The children of my generation would also attend Greek school 2 or 3 times a week at the church on Robert Boulevard. In nice weather, we would walk, and a lot of times we would walk down along the river, and in inclement weather, we would ride the streetcar. And from where I lived in Riverdale, we would have to go downtown, transfer, and take the streetcar out to Robert Boulevard. The curriculum consisted of learning to read and write Greek. We already knew how to speak the language. The offspring of those first-generation immigrants went to college and became doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, artists, chemists, entrepreneurs, media people. At first, it was only the young men who went to college, but eventually, young women were also able to attend. Many of the young women who did not attend college took courses to become secretaries, bookkeepers, and dental assistants. And during the Second World War, many of the young women did defense work in factories such as NCR. In spite of attempting to keep the Greek culture and religion within the family unit, my friends and other Greeks that I knew were fiercely patriotic and loyal to the United States for giving them an opportunity to carve out a better life for themselves and their families. They became citizens of the United States, became informed about the issues, and never missed voting in an election. They left us a legacy that I am very proud to be part of.
Our community is celebrating its 80 years with this exhibit portraying the Greek entrepreneurs. I took advantage of the knowledge within the walls of this complex for my information. During my school years, I spent many hours in the building that stood in the center of this library park. Just as that building was replaced by this great building, so have many of the downtown structures. In those early years, there was a Greek restaurant on every corner and a couple others in between. I traced their progress searching the categories such as shoe shine parlors, hat cleaners, Coney Islands, confectionery stores, ice cream parlors, barber shops, and bowling alleys. The Greek immigrants came to this land without the knowledge of its language or its customs and embraced their new way of life. They washed dishes, shined shoes, made candy. After all, they did not need to know the language to perform those tasks. The dishwashers became cooks. The cooks became restaurant owners, and the candy makers became confectioners. I found that the most populated business street was West 3rd Street. In the first block, in 1905, was the Zonar's Confectionery with Charles Zonar's and his brother Harry and John at 14 West 3rd. Across the street was the Circle Grill, and next to it was the Dixie Restaurant. The 100 block contained the Columbia Restaurant. In the 200 block was the Clickety Clack, and a few doors down from there was Ernest Boyer's Miami Bar and Grill. The 300 block held the Diamond Restaurant, Perry Paul's Grocery, and at the rear of 342 West 3rd was George Demetrio's Purity Ice Cream. The 400 block, we had Harry George operating the George's Grocery and Deli. The second most populated street was on North Main Street. In front of the old courthouse was the buttered popcorn and peanut stand owned by Sam Carumbas. Across the street was the Green Mill Restaurant, the Elias Warwar's Custom Tailor Shop, and next to the alley was the Riviera, later changing to the Gold Coin. The 100 block contained the Recreation Bowling Alley, the Esquire Grill, and a few doors from there was the Rosemary Candies. On the south side of the Victory Theater was the Gem City Hat Cleaning, renamed the Gem City Ballet in 1967. In 1924, James Pampas started a confectionery at 142 North Main, and in 1927 became the College Inn under the ownership of Apostolos Jello. The 200 block listed the Eat More Restaurant, the Adams House, Johnny K's Reef Club, Betty's Sewing Shop, the Golden Nugget, later changing to VG's Pancake House. The other establishment was the Rainbow Cafe, later changing to Dino's. George Sarametis opened the restaurant at 501 North Main in 1934, and in 1941 changed to Mike's Grill with Mike Pavlakis. In the next block was the Varsity Bowl and Chuck Wagon and the present-day Chili King. In the alley behind 610 North Main was the beginning of the Arbor Tool and Die Corporation, started by Cliff and Eddie Argue. My childhood haircuts were by Nick Gazettis at 708 North Main, and further down was the Green Derby and the Elite Market. The third largest concentration of businesses was on South Ludlow. There we had 3 furriers, was Likas Furriers, Vlahos Furriers, and Nikaitis Furriers. In the South Ludlow block was the Moraine Grill, later becoming the Moraine Embassy. In the next block of South Ludlow was the Green Cottage, and at 134 South Ludlow was the Colonial Jewelry and Repair Shop, operated by Manuel Alex in 1950, and later by his brother George Alex in 1973. A stopping place before and after the movies was the Colonial Grill and Soda Shop. The 200 block had many businesses. The Delmar Grill, the Hats and Caps retail store, later changing to Duke's Men's Store, and across was the Olympia Restaurant. The restaurant at 230 South Ludlow changed owners and names many times. One group of partners in 1923 was Ernest Davis and James Pangus. Ernest's brother Alex was a Stivers High School student, and in the afternoon would wash dishes for them, later going on to medical school. The other business in that block was the Crystal Restaurant. The fourth most populated area was West 5th. Sam Karras' Sam's Lunch was at 9 West 5th. At 19 West 5th was the Hat Cleaners and Shoe Shine by the Panayotou brothers, Evstat, Jim, and the Mustangi. And a few doors down from there was James Thomas's Thomas Hat Cleaners. And next to there then was the Mount Vernon Grill. The Zabakis Brothers and Manos Billiards opened in 1916 at 32 West 5th, and in 1930 became the Royal Recreation Bowling. The fifth group of businesses was on South Main Street. The fourth known business to open in 1905 was at 10 South Main by the Zonars family. It started as a confectionery and in the later years became the Golden Pheasant. The Reibold building tenants were, in 1931, Dr. John Panos, who was the first Greek doctor in the Dayton area. His original offices in 1928 were at 836 Neal Avenue. Businesses in the 100 block of South Main were the Red, White, and Blue Billiards and the Hitching Post. The Fidelity building also contained 4 of our positions. Dr. Gregory Floridas in 1938, Dr. Alexander Davis in 47, Dr. Joe Paley in 1958, and John Velasiadis in 1962. Other businesses in that same block were the Coffee Pot Restaurant, Manhattan Restaurant, and Sunset Grill. The 6th largest concentration was on East 3rd Street. The Elite Lunch stood at 35 East 3rd, operated by Ernest and Lula Davis, and later by Lula and Nick Mellison. At 135 was the Crystal Restaurant with William and Steven Stoikas. At 212 East 3rd was the Karras Hat Cleaner and Blocker with Chris Karras, and in the 400 block was Gus Tasso's Dry Cleaners. The 7th largest group was on East 5th Street. The first recorded establishment was Sam Karumbas, who in 1903 had 2 confectionery stores, one at 21 East 5th and the other at 710 East 5th. and the following year, his brother Sam opened a confectionery at 304 East 5th. The Coney Island Restaurant at 3 East 5th was operated by Nick Pavlakis and Pete Levis in 27, and by Pete Levis in 1935. Next was the Lyric Lunch and Soda Grill at 20 East 5th, and John Skanzakis opened a shoe repair in 1930, and in 42 opened the Mayfair Dry Cleaners. During the years of the Depression, Louis Pironis opened a day-old store at 339 East 5th Street. Went to all the restaurant owners and assured them of having fresh pies every day, taking back all the unsold pies. Thus, the owners all had fresh pies for their customers, and he, from the sales in the day-old store, was able to recoup the cost of his materials, and in this manner they helped each other out during these hard times. The 8th group was on South Jefferson. We would have found the Central Lunch at 31 South Jefferson, the Coney Island Restaurant at 103 South Jefferson, Tom Yolanza's Hat Cleaners at 107, at 115 was the Ramona Cafe, and at 131 was the Delmont Restaurant. On East 2nd Street, one of the businesses that a lot of you probably remember or have seen photos, it was the Carl George Photography Studio. On West 1st Street, we found the King's Table with Peter Karamblis and Michael Leokakis, and later by Michael and Vici Leokakis. In the next downtown concentration was South St. Clair Street. The first being the Fruit Market Lunch at 25 South St. Clair with Costa and Alex Mariglu in 1928, and in 1954 by James and Mary Polis. We also found John Trajadis' Produce at 32 South St. Clair. And the restaurant at 101 South St. Clair was first owned by George Ustav in 1917, George Sermetis in 1919, and Apostolos and Anna Kerbavis in 1934. Our parents brought their faith with them to this great country, instilling in us a love of country and a love of faith. This can be seen by the young man that with the love of God attended our theological seminary and became Orthodox priest. Our community can lay claim to Father Nick, Father Dean Chichikos, Father Michael McCready's, Father George Tsahakis, and Father Peter Cave. Father Michael McCready's had just started the seminary where his family first moved to Dayton. Father George Tsahakis' father was part of our community in 1922. We should be proud of these entrepreneurs also for doing God's work. In assembling the information, I found the families and their endeavors. I not only saw the Greeks prosper, but also saw the Italians, the Poles, the Germans, and all the other nationalities. The early years were hard on all of them. They all had the same goals for their children, the one with the primary goal being the grammata, the letters. They pushed for their children to get a better education than they had. They all came to make their dreams come true. However, some of those dreams were shattered during the Depression, to which some of those entrepreneurs never made it back, eventually working for others the rest of their lives. Compiling and presenting just a portion of all this information on the Greek entrepreneurs has taken me down memory lane once again. I hope that in some small measure it has brought back memories for you. Thank you.
Things that I was going to talk about have been mentioned again. The number of graduates that the original immigrants had, the fact that they encompass most of the disciplines, most of the professions that we have today. The one thing that I do want to mention, though, is one thing that Bill Pangas gave me, because he did all the research. He told me that there were 18 attorneys, 11 dentists, and 37 physicians. He couldn't count the engineers and the scientists, I guess. They're not available. Not as visible. The important thing that I want to mention is this. Of these professionals, we see how they have excelled, how they have become known both nationally and internationally. We see judges, we see principals, Greg already mentioned those. We see chiefs of staff and directors of large hospitals. We see CEOs of major organizations. We see entrepreneurs, people who are involved with new businesses and enterprises, tool making was one of them. The design of tools and special equipment. Pharmacists. There was a whole gamut, upscale restaurants, things that transcended the things that the original immigrants had. And the thing that struck me more than anything was, this was not just chance that this happened. This was because I think they learned the value of hard work, a strong work ethic and initiative when they worked for their parents in the early years. And to continue this then for one more generation, the children of the children, we see that the same family values are driving them toward the same kinds of successes. We see excellence in what they are doing today, and we hope to continue this. That's it.
Okay, in spite of the fact that they tried to run us out of time, we still have a couple minutes if there's any questions. What they were trying to do was speak long enough so nobody could ask them a question. So, but they still have a few minutes. Do you have a question?
Yes. What percentage of Greek Americans maintain their Greek heritage, particularly in terms of their membership in the Greek Orthodox Church?
Good question. We'll probably turn to the professor for that. Does anybody have an idea?
In the Dayton area or
of
in
a
the whole
percentage?
area?
In the Dayton area.
In the Dayton area, he means the area.
I would say 99%.
Oh, that's unusual.
No, some people are saying no, Greg.
Pardon me?
No, not that much.
Well, I'm not talking about now, beyond, I'm talking about what we were talking about, the issues.
Now.
Okay, yeah.
Now?
Yes.
Oh, I couldn't answer.
It was a high percentage.
Yeah, the question was, what percentage of Americans of Greek descent are still retaining that ethnicity, like through the Greek Orthodox Church?
A lot of them.
There's a lot, and we don't have a percentage on that.
Yeah.
But one thing that is interesting, and our guest speaker also mentioned it, is that 7 out of every 10 marriages are interfaith marriages. The only reason we know that is because they're interfaith marriages within our church. So, you know, a lot of them are coming to our church.
You say interfaith, but they're all Christian. You mean ethnic, different ethnic?
Well, interfaith in that it's either they're Christian, yes.
Yes.
But they're Protestant. They're non-Greek. They're non-Orthodox, and they're
Christian.
They're Christian. But the question was, how many people maintain their Greek ethnicity? And I'm saying one indication we have of that is 7 out of 10 marriages are interfaith. Those marriages are still within our church. So one of the two people are Greek Orthodox, and they're retaining that ethnicity. But we really don't have an answer.
Percentage-wise.
Percentage-wise. But you may want to take that on, and we'll get the answer and get back with us. Are there any other questions?
Harry, it would just be interesting while the graphics in the beginning, so how many families are represented here today?
Okay, the question was, do we know how many families are represented today on what they talked about? So I guess your question is, like everybody stand up if your family was mentioned, or somebody mentioned? So
You want to stand up?
So if they talk about your family, why don't we stand up and just for a second, just so we can see how many people are still around. Let's do a 7th inning stretch, yeah.
Family is mentioned.
You're representing your family.
Oh, yeah.
Stand up. Listen to me. Stand up. Stand up.
So you can see that
Your husband Nick.
it looks like about 30%, about 30% of the people in this room were mentioned here. So I think they did their homework very well.
I'll tell you one thing that has transpired now, when I was talking about McPherson Town and Lower Riverdale, the group that we grew up with, twice a week, a lot of this group get together for lunch. 60-some years we've been together. I
And you
from the
even let
start as little
outsiders
kids.
in, don't you?
No,
You
pardon?
even let outsiders
And we
come.
even let some outsiders come in also. And we go to the Marine Embassy on Wednesday and have avolemo soup. Then we go on Thursdays to Nick Rozaki's place, the Chili King, and have avolemo soup. So we've been together now for 60-some years.
But those are all men, correct?
Oh, women are allowed. Madam President,
It would be hard to say who was included and who wasn't in this because of the fact when I first started to put my presentation together, they beat me over the head and said, you can't talk that long. I took a condensed write-up of that, and it's a pass out in the back of the table. I see you had one, the white copy of 6 pages. And in there, even at that, I left out names that really I would like to have included, especially from all the families and all that I found here in the library, tracing our immigrants and what businesses they got into. So there's no way that I could present that or the panel here in a half hour, in an hour. We would be here till tomorrow if we start listing all the families. So there's a lot of people in here. I know we did not mention their family names or their businesses, but they're in there. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to, do you have one more question?
Yeah.
This is a question to all panelists, and I was wondering what is your vision of the future of the community here?
What is the vision of the future, did you say?
What is the vision of the future of this community? Anybody want to tackle that one?
all I can say is as you go to church, you see all these kids, my goodness, kids every place, young kids. So that speaks well.
I could say that when our church, the present building was first built, Mr. Jellop sat inside the church with it empty and he looked and he says, how are we going to fill this place? Only the doves are going to come in here into this building. And yet, with the space and the limitations we have, I would say, outgrown our building now. I mean, we are packed in there every Sunday.
I'm speaking somewhat from the woman's point of view. In the past several years since I retired, I became very active in Philoptochos and have gotten very involved in baking and cooking and getting ready for the festival. Now, in that aspect, we don't see too many younger women stepping in. That's right. And that's a little panicky because we're all, like the average age is 70 or something. And you say, gee, I'm going to keep doing this as long as I possibly can. But from that point of view, we depend a lot on that. You see those young kids there in church, a lot of them, but you don't see a lot of the young women yet coming in. But I'm thinking that maybe when they retire from their jobs, they too will become active in that. So they'll be lowering our average age.
Katie, why do you think that you do not see the young women there?
I think you don't see them at this time because, first of all, they have younger children.
They're busy.
They're busy, and the children do not go just to a neighborhood school where they could go play at McKinley Park. Their parents have to take them to soccer, and they have to take them here, and they have to take them to ballet, and they do this and this and this. So that by the time all those activities are completed, they get dinner, there's still laundry, and the house has to be cleaned and so on. I think their energy is not, I don't think they have the time yet. I don't know.
What do you think about, you said you were the first woman in that neighborhood to complete a college education. How many do you think of the Greek girls have a college education today? Once they have that college education, they feel like going their careers too. So I think the careers are a lot more than they were when maybe you were raising children.
Oh, I'm sure that's true. But again, we still need those people to come,
I know.
come in.
Then that's up to us to work
We have to
away.
wait till they're 65 and over.
Right. Okay, at this time, now that we're right back on schedule again, I'd like to bring Father Dean up here for some closing remarks. I would like to just say one thing. Well, Father Dean's been in the community probably about a month and a half now. He came in and didn't know what he was getting into.
Sunday.
Yeah, just one Sunday we said, well, here it is, Father. But I'm sure that he will have some very inspiring words, short words. He thought it was a one-day job, and here he is.
Thank you, Harry. You're very true in saying that I have a very tough act to follow. I did not realize how difficult you people of Dayton are. I'm just starting to get to remember all of your names, and you bring all of these other people's names, and I have no idea who they are. I'm going to have to remember their names too and find out where they're from. But I really do appreciate your kindness for allowing me to be part of this program. I first want to congratulate the committee. I think they did a wonderful job. I think it's important that we also, again, acknowledge them. Greg Karras did a wonderful job. Judge Ganeras, another wonderful job. Bill Pengus, another wonderful job. Katie Scott, another wonderful job. And Demetrius Zonars did a wonderful job. I am going to talk to Dr. Anagnostu later to see how we will be able to bring him from Columbus to Dayton to live here so that we can have him speak to us whenever we want him, because he did a wonderful job. Please, please. Also, Harry did a wonderful job keeping everybody in line. Madam President, Kat, wonderful job. And Tim, who is standing over here, now we want you to remember from this day forward, you are an honorary Greek. And you will continue, I hope, to have wonderful programs and exhibits as we have here. And that when we call upon you, I hope that you will be very able, willing to assist us in the things that we would like to have, because I think it's important that from this point, we will be able to show this community of Dayton and the area who we are as Greek American people. So I thank you for your offering of this wonderful event today. And you have to promise me that, because if you don't, you can't eat. And obviously, how can we continue or even end this program? Everything that you see here that was said, that you have looked upon the walls, that you have heard, has been provided to us by the efforts of one woman. She has worked diligently. Now, I don't know how far before I got here, but I know from the time that I have been here, and she has brought me here, and we've had already 4 or 5 meetings, and we would meet and discuss, because she wanted this to be the most beautiful and excellent program for all of you. And I think we must, in fact we should, show our expression to Eli Bombakidis for doing a wonderful job. She always does that. Every time I mention her name, she runs away. I think she thinks someone else is going to do something else. But Ellie, believe me, it was wonderful. You should be commemorated. You do, and on behalf of all of us here, please accept our thanks for the wonderful job that you have done. I want you to, when you get the opportunity, to look at these books that she has put together. This will be the permanent record in this library. All the people from now and until the second coming will know who Greek Americans are in this community. And this is what we should be proud of. But we should be more thankful for Ellie and her dedication. I thank you very much. My 3 seconds are up. So again, I thank you all, and I do really appreciate your support for this program today. And Doctor, as you know, today we celebrated another great day in the history of our church, of our homeland, October the 28th of 1940, Orchid Day. Today.
Yes, are you celebrating?
Yes, I'm celebrating, and I know you're celebrating. Ellie, you never told me about this. I'm going to have to rethink about bringing him up here to Dayton. But it's a true, again, this is a wonderful celebration event in the history, and we're very so happy to have you all. Thank you very much.
That concludes the program. As you know, the Dogs Penelope has a very wonderful display of food in there. I assume most of you are going to want to get in there because we slightly probably went over the 105 capacity for the room here today. I'll ask you if you want to partake. I would go through this door here and come out the rear door here. And if a couple people might want to help me stack up a couple of chairs to kind of free up some floor space, I think we can have most of the reception in here. So thank you all very much for coming today. Oh, one last announcement I promised Talia would give is that she has not only has these photographs here, but on the library website we have the entire collection of photographs digitized.